term in esports that's really overused, I'd go as far as to say abused, is consistency. Often within the bounds of inconsistency. That's the way people will use it. They'll say this player's inconsistent, or oh, he could be a very great player, but he has consistency problems, or he's just inconsistent in some games. And the implication is always like, if he could overcome that, or he will overcome that. And you should judge in a different sense than just looking at what you have in front of you. And the problem with this is consistency, inconsistency. These terms are really useful terms actually, but they should be used sparingly. We should really analyze the situation and look, is this player actually inconsistent? What is potentially causing what we're seeing as inconsistency? Is that really inconsistency? And the reason why I bring this up is because it's not just used by like naive people who are just, maybe they're brand new to the game, they're just fans of that player. It's used by a lot of people, and even people who should maybe know better, people who are experts. So you see casters saying it all the time. You see fans who like long-term fans saying it about players who've been around years. You especially see people in terms of like other players talking about their teammates or people they've played against. Because the main area I've noticed with this is, what brings it to mind initially is the fact that it is so overused. Like I've seen people talk about like 10 players from Counter-Strike Global Offensive, and Counter-Strike, by the way, Counter-Strike Global Offensive and League of Legends are the two games I mainly see this the most in. I've seen people maybe talk about like 10 or 20 players who are all players who aren't star players, aren't elite players, but every now and then have a game that maybe borders on what an elite player does. And that's where this is always used. It's always like the go-to default lazy cliche hackneyed thing that people, fans, casters, other players will say about that player, like, oh yeah, he's a very good player, but he's just inconsistent. And they never break it down more than that. They never say in what areas is inconsistent, give some examples of like, well, here's what I think is his consistent, here's what his level could be consistently, here's where the inconsistency comes in. It's just thrown out there as this vague term. Now, the main flaw I see with this in terms of how people are mentally processing the situation to come to the conclusion that the person is just inconsistent is they will essentially take the highest end. If you imagine the players on a spectrum, okay? And so we'll make this like the bottom end of the spectrum, so like 0% performance level. And we'll make this the top end, 100% performance level. And so let's say the player has a game which is like, yeah, let's say like 90% performance level for how good he is and what he's capable of doing and his skill set and his teammate and the circumstances he's in. He has a 90% level game. They'll take the 90% level game and they'll say, they won't say this actually, but the way they interpret it as inconsistency is they'll in their mind place that as if that could be his 50% performance level, and that he could do that day in, day out. He could do that 7 out of 10 matches. He could do that every single week. He could do that 2 or 3 times a month. He could have a year where he could play on that level, have that sort of a game, maybe 40 times, maybe 30 times. And the thing with that is, before we even give examples of players or talk about these kind of situations, the reason why this annoys me as an overused term and an abused term is that in almost all cases, when you actually take that example I just gave there of how they're kind of creating the situation, framing it in their mind, you'll see just from the eye test and reasoning that in nearly all cases, the player they're talking about, that is a totally ridiculous scenario, that the player could play at that really almost max performance level in like most games or even regularly, like at 90% level. They don't look at his real 50% level as it is right now. And this is another crucial thing. If it's a player who's only played a couple of months, maybe he's only gone to a couple of tournaments, there's still room where, okay, maybe we haven't quite seen what this guy is. Maybe there was just some initial teething problems and he'll very quickly get over that, or whatever it may be. But when we're talking about players who've played for years and they've got hundreds of competitive matches under their belt, they've got matches against the same sort of opponents where they have like occasional good games, they have bad games. At this point, you kind of do know where that player, you do know what the 50% level performance is. And whatever, let's say the 60 to 70%, well, I'd probably say the 40 to the 60% performance level is the real range you want to be looking for in his game to decide how good he actually is. And crucially, this video isn't about deciding how good he is, but to decide what his consistency level is. Now, it's actually quite rare that there are players who only and this is another way you'll hear this inconsistency thing phrased, there are very, very few players who only have like either 75 to 90% performance level games or like 25 to 40% performance level games. It's very, very rare. As you'd expect, the majority of players are smack bang almost every game within that 40% performance level to 60% performance level. That's right where the majority of their games were. If you were to take 100 games and chart whereabouts they would be on this level, you'd have this massive grouping of dots right within that area, maybe extending to like 70% and down to 30%. But on the other ends, you'd have only occasional dots. And as a result, in like a mathematical statistical sense, if you're trying to figure out what this average player's level is, you'd remove those ones on the outside. They're outliers, they don't matter. And you'd focus on this main area here, and you'd take that information, then you'd draw an average from that, and you'd have a good sense of how good this player actually is. So aside from that being an obvious way of people framing it in a, I don't think in a disingenuous way, I don't think people actually actively try to deceive in this manner. I think they're just a bit naive in terms of how they analyse, or they just hope for something more than what is there in reality. So if we were to take some examples from the two games I said, CSGO and League of Legends, first of all, what I'll do is I'll give you some examples of players who this is always said about. And then I'll give you some examples of players where they likewise have a similar quality to their game, but no one ever says it about them. We all accept that that's who these players are. So in CSGO, people will always talk about the player Bialy from Virtus Pro, this Polish player, entry fragger, and they'll talk about Kiyoshima from LDLC, the French team, very skilled AK player. And previously, the classic example previous to this was someone like JW or Guardian. So in terms of these CS examples, Bialy has a round, 2 rounds where he'll just one bullet everyone, he'll just hit a 6 spray that kills 2 people instantly, and people will be like, oh, he's such a great player, but he's inconsistent. Now in Bialy's case, he actually is a very good player. Like he's, in terms of players in the world, he's not on the tier 1, but he's on tier 2, certainly. He's at the higher end of tier 2, like approaching it, but it's very unlikely he's ever going to get into tier 1 because the problems he has as a player come down to aspects like decision making. Sometimes I think he not necessarily has nerve issues, but I think he has to set his shots up in a certain way. And so as a result, now that we've seen all these games of him, you could chart how all his games are, and you'll see that actually the really extreme level games where he plays like a tier 1 player are so rare that it's not that he's inconsistent. Actually, he's quite consistent. He's consistent as a tier 2 player, and the inconsistent thing is that every now and then he'll have a tier 1 game. Well, guess what? He also has tier 3 games. No one ever stops and goes, you know what? If he just like consistently was a bit worse, he'd be tier 3 player. Like no one ever goes that way. That wouldn't even be a way to go. Yeah, everyone imagines that somehow he could become a tier 1 player. Yeah, what's the evidence to show that? Tier 1 players just play like tier 1 players, and then their sort of 40 to 60 level range is worthy of a tier 1 level player. It's their outliers aren't the tier 1 games. That all their tier 1 performances would be smack bang in that 40 to 60% performance range. That's why they are the tier 1 players, because that is just every day for them is to be tier 1. Players who very rarely are just aren't. So the previous example obviously was JW, but differences in JW, he's a rare example of someone where a mixture of getting the right teammates to shift into different positions to put him in the right positions again and take some of the pressure off him and alleviate aspects on the map, like open areas of the map up, because for example Crims now helps the stability of Fnatic and then locks down a certain bomb site, and so opens JW up to be a bit more freeing. A mixture of those qualities and actually developing, which very rarely happens, from that sort of talented player who has some sort of nerve or performance issues into someone who's just knocking it out of the park every time, which is maybe like a 1 in 100 thing in esports in terms of good players who have that talent. It's 1 in 100 that they actually get it together and become the godlike players. If they ever had those issues earlier, usually the godlike players in general are the ones who just don't have those issues. They come in, they're good, they perform well, they just keep performing better, and it goes that way. He's a rare example, so he actually gets out of this category because that's not the issue for him. Same with Kiyoshima. Kiyoshima will sometimes have that like 28 frag half where you're like, wow, this guy could dominate the game. Then you look at the other games and he's missing the same shots over and over. He's going for aggressive scenarios where clearly that's poor decision making. Like he's put himself in situations where if he did those crazy shots that he hits in the 28 frag game, yeah, he'd be a god. But he can't do those most of the time. He's overextending his reach. Maybe he imagines himself to be better than he is. Maybe he doesn't understand his role, or he hasn't got quite the right role for him yet. And he doesn't have teammates in the right situation. Whatever it may be, he's not that tier 1 player yet. If you go over into League of Legends, for the same category, two people come right to mind for me. So we've got Pobelta, the North American mid laner. He plays for Evil Geniuses. now called Winter Fox. All right, Metal Gear Solid. And Kerp. Kerp was the mid laner for Millennium up until recently. Previously the top laner of Ultimate before that. And he retired after they failed to get back into the LCS in the promotion series. And so these two players, both same quality essentially. I actually think if you'd ever seen Pobelter get into some playoffs, you'd have seen a similar level of performance to what happened with Kerp. Because basically what would happen was, in Pobelter's case, I think mainly a lot of the hype came from streaming. I think that's mainly where it was, and a mixture of other pro players saying like, oh, he's really skilled in practice, or that sort of shite. But every now and then, yeah, he'd have like a play where he'd do a really sick play, or he'd have like one game where, especially if it was against a top 4 LCS level team, where he'd play really high level, like he'd win a matchup really impressively, or he'd just have a sequence of plays where he won the game for his team or gave them a chance to win a game, and people would say like, oh, he's such an unrefined talent, like he's going to become a great player, oh, it's just because he's in school, and they have all these reasons. But in reality, he's played enough games now where it seems unlikely he's going to have any exponential growth. Like, we kind of know who he is, we know what his problems are, and a lot of his problems seem to stem from things that aren't to do with his school. Not that it's like nerve issues, it's like performance aspect, what role he's using in his team, how to use your teammates. It seems like it's very unlikely he's actually going to now become an elite level player and he's going to become a world-class player. We kind of know what he is. In terms of Kerp was the example of a player where I'll actually give him some credit in as much as he is more like a rare case. Like I talked about where it's unlikely that the player mainly has really good games or really shit games. I think he's one of the rare examples I've ever seen of a player who actually was more like that. Like I think if you looked, he would have had, still the majority of his games would have been in the 40 to 60%. But I'd say for a player who isn't tier 1, he probably had more tier 1 games than anyone else who's in like tier 2, if that makes sense. As in, all the other people in tier 2 were either just like solid players who had loads of tier 2 games, and you're like, yeah, that's obvious, or they were players who were like, yeah, well, that's the main category actually. So in his case though, I just said he probably had quite an even split actually between the tier 3 games, tier 1 games and tier 2 games. But that's crucially why I've explained it like that, using this paradigm of tiers of how good the player is. Because the people who say, oh, he's just inconsistent, and then the implication is he could be a great player, are only looking at 2/3 of the equation. They're looking at, okay, here's his tier 1 games, he just plays like a tier 2 player, just plays good. Here's his tier 1 games, like, wow, he's got all these tier 1 games, like, wow, he could go from tier 1 to tier 2. And then what they're ignoring is, whoa, wait a minute, look at all the tier 3 games. And let's look how many tier 3 games. Oh, there's almost as many tier 3 games as tier 1 games. First of all, when we draw an average through all of that, it's going to come right down in tier 2, pretty much bang in the middle almost. Secondly, in the same way as you're going, well, he could go up to tier 1, why are you never going, oh, well, if he degrades as a player and his position gets worse, remember, so you can magically improve decision making, why can't it get worse? Evolution is such a misunderstood term in the world, because evolution doesn't mean improves. It just means changes. And so it's just as a change can be positive, a change can be negative. And changes do follow. Things go extinct, they no longer have a place, they develop in worse ways. These things can happen. So just as you have essentially, people who say that have a chauvinism towards improvement only happening. Like, you never degrade as a player. Yet, why couldn't Kerp have issues where he degraded as a player and became a tier 3 player? It's just as logical, just potentially even just as likely. No, it's very hard to become better. It's actually a lot easier to become shit as far as I can tell in the game. But that's just a chauvinism of how people think and what they have biases themselves towards, or their own paradigm of what can happen in the game. So try doing that. Next time you hear someone say, like, this player is really talented but he's inconsistent, try doing that, what I did with Kerp there. The two things I did there, either do like the Bialy thing and go, okay, how many times does he have the tier 1 game and does he have the tier 2s? If he's got loads of the tier 2s, probably just a tier 2 player. It's very unlikely he's going to become that, and that's just a rare thing. If we're talking about like the Kerp type guy, then let's look at the Kerp guy and say, okay, does he have tier 1 games? Yeah, wow, he has a lot. He has a lot of tier 2 games as well. But how many tier 3 games does he have? Take that and take the whole thing. Essentially, what I'm saying there is expand the data set enough and try and encompass their whole career, all the matches of that type. Like, if he has a great game under pressure here, let's look at the other pressure games, and you'll start to see who the person is. the stats will actually tell you if you get the processes of how to interpret them. They'll tell you who this guy is, what he's like in this situation, what he's like in that situation. Yeah, if he's only played 2 or 3 matches, you haven't got enough information, or at least you haven't got enough to draw a strong conclusion. If you've got 100 matches, 50 matches, well, now you're starting to get quite close to having you can make some pretty strong conclusions, and you can actually say with some kind of confidence, like, okay, in this situation, he's going to be like this, and this is the sort of performance I'll expect on this, and the chances of him having a tier 1 performance, maybe 10% in this particular situation, and he might have a tier 3 performance, 15% in this situation. You can actually run the numbers. You can actually come up with quite a good framework beyond just the eye test, because remember, the problem with the eye test is, and the eye test is very good, by the way, you should always apply it, is that just in terms of memory, some people, I mean, it's not as much of a problem for me personally because I've developed my memory and it's something I've focused on a lot, but some people will just remember a great performance and then a not great performance, especially if it's a play they really like. They'll just sort of casually forget that, conveniently forget. I'm not saying that even that they're doing it maliciously. They'll actually, it's just naturally the way their mind works. It won't stick with them, and if they have an average performance particularly, they'll just think like, yeah, whatever, and that won't be assigned much value. But then the really good performance, they'll assign so much value. It's so memorable that when they later talk about, like, no, Kirk's one of the best middle-aged, that's what they're thinking of, is that one game where he went crazy on Fizz. That's what's coming to mind. Like, and if he used to do that every time, and if you do that next time versus this guy, you know, that's where these implications come from. So now I'm going to give you some counter examples where these are great players. These really are amazing tier 1 players, and yet they themselves don't always play tier 1 games. And yet none of us think of these players as like inconsistent in that sense of like, well, they could be improved, could be improved. And crucially, the reason why we don't is because with these players, because they are great, so you don't have to, because usually this term's being used to like cover up players who are just like middling or like good but not quite good enough as people want them to be or think they could be. Because these players aren't in that category, we just accept that they are who they are, and we don't expect ridiculous improvements out of them. We expect them to be sort of around that level, and we know that sometimes they'll have a better game and sometimes they'll have a worse game, but here's their reasonable level. So in Counter-Strike Global Offensive, the 2 names that come to mind for me is Forest and Shox. In terms of Forest, the thing with Forest is there actually are some fanboys who do say about Forest, like, he's like the best in the world, and they do that thing I've said of just remembering the crazy kills. The people who are reasonable, like other pros I've seen talk about him and historically experts, they do acknowledge, like, listen, the thing with Forest is he does have exceptional otherworldly games where he is the best player to ever play CS, and he's the most skilled player to ever play CS, and he has the best aim of anyone who's ever played CS. First of all, those games are fairly rare. Like, maybe he has one of those otherworldly games, like, I think if we're being reasonable, I'd probably say 1 in 20 maps. That's probably even generous, maybe 1 in 30 maps, an otherworldly performance. Now then, he has really good performances, maybe, let's say, between 5 and 8 times out of 30 maps. I think that's pretty fair. And then he has good performances, sort of like maybe another 5 to 10. And then he has medium performances, which are just good, and for a top pro are pretty good, but just good. And then he has some average, and he has some bad performances as well, like 5 of them every 30. You know, that sort of range. And if we put it like that, the reason why Forrest is a great player is because when you add it up, he's got enough that don't need to happen rarely to make him tier 1, definitely. But now, is he the best? No, he hasn't got enough tier 1, or his level in terms of what he does do the majority of the time in the 40 to 60% performance range isn't as high as some of the other players who do that day in and day out at a better level. Likewise, Shox. The thing with Shox is, in modern day, I'm actually going to take Shox as an example now, because there was a time in late 2013 where Shox really did hit this insane level where he almost every game was hitting like some of the best performances we've ever seen, win or lose. Like, the way he played the game, whether he got the kill or not even, was just so exceptional. Like, I don't know if anyone will be able to recreate that kind of form. But overall, Shox's general form in CSGO has been to have like the exceptional game, the exceptional run of rounds, and then just a good level for the other ones. And so he's a great player, etc. And no one looks at him and like, oh, he could do this, could do that. Like, we know what Shox is. We know what and so now, if Shox plays badly or he has issues performing, we look at other factors. We go, how is he being used in his team? What teammates does he have? What role does he himself imagine him to have in the team? Does he have some sort of mental problems at the moment? Is he got a psychological disadvantage when he plays this sort of team? We look at other factors, but we look at them in their own right. We don't say, well, he's just inconsistent. We know he's a great player, and that much is justified. In League of Legends, the two names I came up with was Dade, former mid laner of Samsung Blue and Samsung Ozone, won an OGN title with each. And the thing with Dade is he's either had these really sick runs or he's had these slumps. And so it'd be very easy to actually say, well, Dade's inconsistent. Because the thing with Dade is, if you looked at his best games in OGN, these are some of the best games ever played by any player at any position in OGN and League of Legends. Like, remember that Twisted Fate performance against CJ Frost? This is unreal stuff. He's had some Yasuo games that were out of this universe, some Zed games. His top end of tier 1 performances, his 90 to 95% performance scale performances are so fucking insanely good that they exist, but we don't say, oh, if he could do that every time, or oh, he's inconsistent and somehow we could get to that level. And the reason why we don't say that, and the reason why I picked such an extreme example, is because if he could do that every day of his life and, 2 out of every 3 games, he'd be the best player to ever play this game by far. He'd be way better than Faker. No one would be able to ever touch him. His team would probably never lose a game, almost. So it's totally unrealistic to do that. And yet, that's not extreme in as much as, well, you're being silly there. No, all I've done there is take the same example of the Pobelter type guy or the Bialy type guy and just scale it up a bit. I haven't taken the proportion out of whack. I've taken the exact same proportions of what people are expecting they could be or they should be, or only looking at certain small sample of games and ignoring the rest. And I've just scaled it up, as in I've just moved it up a level to the elite level. I've taken what's down here and moved it up. I haven't changed the overall scale of the concept. Maybe I used the wrong term, scaling up there. I just moved it up in terms of what the actual magnitude of the figures are. Now, I picked Dade for that. A great Western example is Expeke. We don't say Expeke is inconsistent. We don't say he's got some kind of problems. We know exactly who Expeke is. We know exactly the champions he's good on. We know the kind of circumstances he's very likely to be good on. He's better in playoffs than a regular season. Tends to be pretty good against certain types of matchups. Other certain types of player styles can sometimes befuddle him a little bit. But yeah, Expeke does have those Forest type games where he's so godlike, so unreal, that I think that's why people sometimes overrate him and call him the best Western player. And also has some terrible games, actually, where if people were a bit harsher, they'd go in on him and they'd say, oh, he let the team down. But actually, overall, as much as Expeke has the godlike games and the bad games, also he has quite a lot of godlike games, and he has so many good games that are within his 40 to 60%, and so many high-level ones there, but you don't need to say he's inconsistent. Actually, he does have consistency. He does show consistency, and it's a good level. And we even know the circumstances, the type of games that he's going to do well in. So as a result, we know who Expeke is, and no one's naively imagining that Expeke is good. Let's use what people say about high on Expeke. Oh, well, if Expeke just was more motivated and he went to Korea and he just practiced on screen solo queue, just expanded his champion pool, then yeah, he'd be the best player in the whole world. No one's ever going to do. Because in his case, that's how you'd have to move that up a level, is to say he'd be the best player in the whole world. No one's really thinking like that, are they? Now, notice when I've given some of these examples here of things that could cause the inconsistency, I've presented it initially from the point of view of, you know what, maybe they're just not that good. Maybe what you think is inconsistency is just how good they are. And occasionally they have a game which is above how good they actually are and is unusual. Now, the reason why I go with that is because some of these issues that I'm going to get into now actually always come back to that to a degree or are tangentially connected to it. So let's talk about some of the things that could be causing inconsistency. So one is haven't played the game enough, so experience, either experience on a pro level or just experience with the game. If you play it more, they'll get some of these things down. Yeah, there's something to that. But even so, remember when I said when you have a small data set, you don't draw strong conclusions. So if you've only seen someone play 10 pro games, then if you had 2 really exceptional games, it's not reasonable to say he could get to that level, he will get to that level, if he changes X and Y, he'll get to that level. It might be that some of those were a fluke to a degree, or they were maybe in that particular game, an opponent really did play particularly badly or particularly foolishly in a certain situation, which magnified how good this guy looked in that situation. The difference is he wouldn't do that against a really exceptional player playing well, whereas a faker type guy can do the best plays ever against even someone doing really good plays themselves. There's a difference in that sort of exceptional performance. So okay, experience, that's one. Nerve issues is obviously one. And when you talk about nerve issues, now you're getting into the world of psychology and the world of the mind. how motivated is this guy? Like, what's wrong with him that makes him not want to play more? You could talk about why does he choke under pressure, or why does he have a dip in form when he plays against a certain type of opponent? Like I've gone over and over in many of these Thorin Thoughts videos, that is such a complicated, murky, swamp-like world of mist and fog to navigate, with so few navigational tools and kind of maps and charts and paths set out, that I don't really think it's worth pretending like if there's going to be easy solutions there. It's very rare that actually people get over those things. And crucially, not only do they not fix them overnight, but it takes a long time. And also, I actually think that the inconsistency thing of masking these players who have these issues, of saying, oh, well, they would be, actually kind of works against them ever fixing it. Because what some of these people, fans, casters, teammates, friends are doing is actually kind of giving the guy credit for what he hasn't been able to do because of his problems, ignoring his problems, like saying, oh, well, you are a great player, like you just had a bad game there, or you'll get over your nerve issues. Whereas actually getting over his nerve issues is what will allow him to be the great player. And so if you give him the credit already and you say you've got all that already and don't worry about it, then unless he's a very self-driven person, maybe he won't ever put in the proper effort to it. He won't think it's a big enough deal that he has to fix it. I mean, I think this would be an obvious case that we've seen with Link from CLG in that sense. It's not that he's shit. That's ridiculous when people pretend that. He clearly has these issues, and part of the problem with it is that, well, I've always said he either has to shit or get off the pot. Like, he either should have just decided, like, listen, it's not for me. It's not even what I want to do in my life, therefore I'm going to just quit. Or he should have buckled down and gone like, right, I've got some real issues. I've got to take massive action. It's like that, what's that guy, Anthony Robbins? He always makes some sort of comment like, if you've got like if you want to change something, the best way to do it is like massive radical action or some shit like that, some sort of motivational speech. So in Link's case, yeah, he himself should have come to that conclusion, but part of what allowed him not to was that CLG as an organisation picked up on it way too late. They noticed the trend way too late after like multiple seasons of LCS and other people failing and kind of moving those pieces out and saying, oh, we still got one piece here that always has problems. Secondly, they sort of supported some of the bad aspects of it, like, oh, don't worry about that, and ignore haters and all that sort of thing. And then also, they kind of set up a situation where it was acceptable to have these problems. There was no repercussions. There wasn't any kind of a big deal. And so even if it gets changed now, there's a degree to which, in terms of when it should have been changed, yeah, it's too little too late, isn't it? And so another aspect that I want to bring up in this issue is, let's say someone was to use all these terms that I've said before about a player being inconsistent, and if he was to get to his top level, think how great he'd be. Here's a great player to use that for. Imagine you heard someone tell you that about Doublelift, and they said, if he was just more adaptable in the sorts of champions he was willing to play in the lane matchups, and not be stubborn sometimes and try and force something through, or naively think that a champion's bad just because he doesn't like it and he thinks that player's cheap for using it. If he didn't have that mentality, and you know what? If he didn't misposition in terms of like team fights, and if he didn't go too aggressive sometimes, if he didn't do all these things, he'd be the best AD carry. Now, if someone said that to you, if you're a reasonable person who's watched a lot of League of Legends, and crucially if you watch my video assessing Doublelift, then I think you'd realise that like that is a ridiculous set of circumstances, because those aren't weird things that are happening. Those are core problems that have always been a part of his game, and crucially some of them come from his personality and who he is as a person. Like his mispositioning comes from poor decision making and just not being a guy who, in terms of certain cerebral aspects of the game, is well versed, well suited to kind of make the right decision there. Or I think sometimes he lacks an intuitive feel for the game beyond the individual skills, etc. Of like the strategical aspect of when will a player be here and what should he do then. I don't think he's that great at visualizing that stuff. And also in terms of the stuff I said in terms of the part about his stubbornness, I mean, that does seem to come from him as a person. Like, as a person, he has certain ways of thinking about the world or ideas. And so, in this sense, it's not really that these are like fluke anomalies. These are in the same way he has strengths, like sick mechanics, great confidence level, very good knowledge of laning and what to do then. In the same way as those are strengths, and you don't just imagine they'll go away for no reason. These are weaknesses, and you don't just suddenly imagine they will be removed or taken away or whatever. Yeah, you can improve your strengths, you can improve your weaknesses as well, but these aren't being framed in the correct way. And so crucially, those are just flaws in his game. They're not just weird inconsistency things. Now, in terms of people saying that thing of like, oh, but if he just, that's one of the things that kind of tilts me the most and makes me want to make a video like this, is that it's never framed as like let me do it reasonably. Okay, if Doublelift somehow gained a significantly superior understanding of decision making, kind of flow charting, what to do in certain situations, and weighing up and weighting what the options are, and understanding the permutations possible, and being able to visualize what to do from a situation to get out of it. If he could do all that, get ready, as a result of like heavy study of the game, analysis of his own game, deep reflection, speaking to others to get an outsider's perspective, studying with people who are very good in this sense and getting to know their minds, see how incredibly expansive and difficult and intensive his course of action would have to be to fix his problem like that. Instead, what they'll say is, if Doublelift just, as soon as that word comes in, just, it's like I've been fucking tasered. Like, really? Just? Or if he just fixes a massive fundamental problem in his game, and crucially, one that if you have that problem, tends to be one of the hardest in the entire world of esports to fix. Or if he just, or only fixed that, he'd be like this good, would he? Do you have something against the English language? Did the English language, like, kill your dad in front of you when you were a kid, and the only way to get back at it is to, like, stab tiny little daggers into it over and over for the rest of your life? I don't even know where that analogy was going, but fuck you. So the reason why it annoys me, though, is because, let me phrase it this way. That would be like if I had a girlfriend who was obese. She's like really overweight. She just eats way too much food. And so as a result, she likes to eat too much food, and she continually, repeatedly, an active habit, eats too much food. And I said to you, as we're stood in a bar, like, yeah, I know my girlfriend's like really fat, but if she just like dieted a lot, then she'd be like a model. So, my girlfriend could be like a model. Then if you were reasonable, you'd be like, well, she seems to really love food. Like, by the way, that in itself, going into the psychological thing, probably comes from some kind of psychological thing of like, maybe that's a way of getting gratification that she can't get elsewhere in her life. Maybe there's some validation that she seeks in other aspects of life, and she's disappointed that she can't get it, and she turns to that, and that's her outlet, and that's the thing she falls back on. Whatever the issues would be, the point is, there's so many things in the way of it, and that are part of who they are as a person, and their everyday actions reinforce and encourage this particular aspect of the behaviour. And then people around saying like, don't worry about it, it's not a big deal, like, yeah, you've got to love you for who you are, and all that sort of shite. That unfortunately, that's actually the least likely thing, was that the person would ever do it. And particularly in a flippant, like, if they just did that, it'd be ridiculous, wouldn't it? And yet that's the equivalent of what some people are doing about these other people here. And now, in terms of sports, in general, I don't see this used as much in sports. I think part of the reason why, and this is a minor pet peeve I have about people who are casters or pundits, is that casters and pundits in esports a lot of them haven't put as much time into how they think about the game. So a lot of them will use these labels just in a lazy way, kind of like a journalist. Some of them will really abuse cliches and just use turns of phrase that are so common, because once they have all that loaded into their brain, then it's kind of like a macro. It's a little shortcut, like, okay, I've got to connect this part to this. Press F1, right? That goes like whatever the cliched, hackneyed saying would be, And so, in the same way as that happens, I think the casters often go to like, he's a talented player, but he's got consistency issues, whatever. And really, in that scenario, they'd be better served by just trying to purposely remove consistency and just explain what his issues are. Like on these particular champions, he doesn't seem to have like an aptitude for playing that sort, and so he has poor performance here. Or when he gets last pick, he doesn't seem to use that very well in terms of countering the enemy. Whatever it would be, you'd be much better served attempting to articulate the issue than just put on this lazy label that at the moment no one's really got a good handle on what the fuck it means. And worst, it's being used for so many players across so many games that's now losing all meaning whatsoever. In real sports, I don't see people use this as much, because a lot of the experts will just do what I just said there. They'll actually look at real things in the game, or make real points, or try and just make a specific, like entirely subjective judgment of that player there, of something that they've noticed, and that's what they'll go with. And as a result, it's got a lot more value to it. Not only is doing... Oh, by the way, as a sports analogy, actually, I'll give you an example of the NBA. So in the NBA, players will have different scores in terms of points scored each match. And unless you are like a Tim Duncan, Kevin Garnett, sort of like all-time great player, but also had a very set sort of game, it's very unlikely that you're going to have like insane, pure consistency. Like Tim Duncan really is ridiculous in as much as if Tim Duncan's averaging 20 points a game in a season, his games really are going to be like 24 points, 17 points, 20 points, 18 points, 27 points, no, actually not really 27, like 22 points, 19 points, 20 points, 19 points, 18 points, 22 points. Like it's going to be ridiculously close to that, and it'll be consistency on a level you never see. But most players, like let's think of like a wing player who scores the 20 points. His points are really going to be like 33 points, 42 points, 15 points, 27 points. Like it's going to go like that. Like there will be a bigger variety in that sense, and so it's unlikely overall that they're going to have a bazillion games that are like the same exact. And so you could say for all of them, oh, they're all inconsistent. Everyone in the whole fucking world's inconsistent. No, it's ridiculous. Now there's no point using the word consistency. We have to use it for the extreme examples, or in a particular case, this is inconsistency. It's very unlikely in majority of sports that players literally have the same game day in and day out, and yet we don't just slap this inconsistency label on them. Not only is this inaccurate analysis, that's my biggest problem with it, but it just becomes this vague label which not only obscures like real analysis and really interesting points and specific points of that player, but also crucially, it tends to be used to kind of mask, when it's by fans and certain people who are teammates, it's used as a way to mask their real weaknesses and problems and write them off as if they're just not a big deal, or they'll magically figure themselves out. It's actually a really negative way of thinking, I think, or it has negative, it's unproductive, okay? So I hope I've addressed this overall, because it's not going to change the world, me making this video. But in terms of how people think, if even just a few people start to frame things in their mind in this particular sense, and know that if they look in this area, you also have to look here to be reasonable and to be fair and all-inclusive, then I think that we can get a lot further in our discussion about players, whether that's CSGO, whether that's League of Legends.